Hello, you're live with BBC News, your voice, your BBC News. We're looking ahead to a major vote later today in the House of Commons on planned reforms to the welfare system. Now, this is a hugely complex but also a hugely important story affecting thousands of people up and down the country. Now, one of the reasons this has been in the news so much is because of the number of twists and turns in this story and the number of changes to these reforms we've seen. It's been a big political challenge for the Prime Minister. That's one of the elements to get into. I've got a fantastic lineup of correspondents and editors joining us to get through this. One of them is here on set with me, Nikki Fox, our disability news correspondent. So good and so useful to have you here with us. Now, as I said, this is both a complex but important news story.
Yes.
Talk us through some of the changes, how the land lies at the minute, and what the Prime Minister has proposed.
OK, well, let's start off first, Rich. We're talking about personal independence payments and what they actually do. So PIP is a benefit designed to help cover the extra costs that disabled people face. And I mention that because I think that gets lost somewhat, because we're hearing a lot, the government are talking a lot about getting more disabled people into work. But there are many people that get this extra cost benefit PIP who are in work, and claiming PIP enables them to cover the extra costs of working and living. You know, it's things like higher energy bills, because some disabled people have to whack the heating on for much longer. It's expensive adaptations that aren't necessarily covered by the local authority, equipment that might not be covered by the NHS, so that's what it is. Now, the original PIP assessment, as it stands, you score points from 1 to 12, and it's basically 0 for no difficulty, 12 for the most difficulty. So a person claiming PIP could score fewer points across the board, so 2 points across the board, and then get that entitlement to PIP. It's also worth mentioning PIP comes in 2 components. So you've got the daily living component and the mobility component. We're just focusing on the daily living component. That's the only component that's being discussed here at the moment. The changes, the government want to implement changes which will come into effect in November 2026, which would mean that a person who's claiming for PIP would have to score a minimum of 4 points. So one of those questions, and those questions are about whether you can wash and dress unaided, about tasks like preparing and eating food. A person will have to get 4 points minimum to be able to score enough points to get the daily living component of PIP. So it's quite a big change for people that might have less complex, less severe needs, that might score a fewer number of points across the board. So that's the big change.
This is hugely confusing. I mean, we were discussing before you came on air.
Yeah.
You live and breathe this.
Yeah.
You focus on it every day. You
Yeah.
report on it for the BBC. And you have been struggling to get your head around some of the complexities here. How can the government expect people who are also trying to hold down a job, raise a family, deal with living with their disability, and also understand what's going on here?
Yeah, it's so confusing. And I've been speaking to other colleagues, other disability journalists as well. And, you know, we're all saying the same thing. We know this system, this is our job, but it somehow gets more confusing. So I understand why we're having so many questions come into the BBC, why I'm getting so many questions from disabled people as to what is going on and how it will impact them, these changes, because PIP has always been that kind of holy grail of benefits for disabled people. You know, it is an extra cost benefit. It isn't an out of work benefit. Life is more expensive if you're disabled, and that is just a fact. You know, we were saying earlier, weren't we, Scope estimates that it's over £1,000 more expensive to be disabled than it is if you're not, and that's set to rise as well. So it is a very important benefit, and these changes, although they are becoming clearer, and I have more information, you know, I spent the weekend trying to get it, it is still very confusing.
Yeah, Nikki, really useful to have you here. Stick with us.
Thank you.
Let's talk to Henry Zeffman now, our chief political correspondent. Henry, good to have you with us. Nikki there talking us through some of the complexities to this hugely important system that thousands of people rely on. First, perhaps the most obvious question, why is the Prime Minister doing this?
Well, there's a couple of arguments that the government advance for reform here. And they would use the word reform, but of course their critics, including within the Labour Party, would use the word cuts. Now, one is that they say, look, the numbers of people who are out of work, and I appreciate, by the way, that not everyone affected by this receives benefits that are related to whether they're in work or not, but I'm just rehearsing the government's argument. They say that the number of people out of work is staggering. The way in which that is projected to rise is staggering. And they say, well, look, the reforms that they propose are only designed to slow the rate of increase in the government's overall welfare spending, as well as the government's spending on various specific benefits. And the government therefore says this is a problem that a party of Labour, it's in their name, a party of work, exists to solve, trying to find ways to get people who are currently out of work due to ill health into work. But there's another undeniable element to this, and it tells you a little bit about the timing of why this was announced and why it was announced in the spring to coincide with a particular fiscal, that's to say economic issue that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, had to solve. And that is that the government needed to save money in order to meet its own borrowing rules, its own rules about how it balances day-to-day spending with the amount of money that's coming in to the Exchequer. And it's kind of that complex mishmash of all sorts of different things going on, all sorts of different arguments, all sorts of different justifications, all sorts of different problems, as the government would see it, to solve, that I think has contributed to the real political difficulty that the Prime Minister and his government find themselves in on this specific piece of legislation today.
Yeah, and we can talk more about the money later, but the number thrown around by Liz Kendall was more than £5 billion she's looking to save. We are expecting a debate on these welfare reforms in the House of Commons at 1:30 this afternoon. The vote itself is at 7 p.m. We will have special coverage of that here across the BBC. Henry, stick with us for now. Nikki, for the moment, you mentioned earlier this key date, November next year. Why is that significant?
November 2026. Well, that is the date that they have said that all new claimants will be subject to these rules. So, there's going to be a review. So Stephen Timms, the Minister for Disabled People, who I met only a couple of weeks ago, will be heading up a review. There has been a consultation, although not a consultation on the changes to PIP. That was a consultation about delaying the health top-up of universal credit, which is an out-of-work benefit. They want to delay that so people who are under 22 can't get it. Also, the switch from disability living allowance to PIP, that was also consulted on. So disability living allowance is basically PIP. Some adults are still on disability living allowance and haven't been switched over. Younger people get disability living allowance before they go to PIP. So we're consulting on that. But there are still, that consultation ended only yesterday, and we've got the universal credit PIP bill. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. But November 26 is the date that's etched in my brain at the moment, because that is the date where the government proposed to change the PIP assessment.
Yeah, OK. But Henry, back to you, if I can, for the time being. We mentioned earlier on the challenges that Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has seen over this. He came in with a thumping majority, and now he's seeing a serious challenge to his power in the House of Commons. Talk us through the opposition he's had, especially from his own MPs.
I mean, it's completely staggering. If you'd asked me, but if you'd asked pretty much anyone on July the 5th, 2024, i.e. the day that Sir Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, we'd have said there's practically no chance of Keir Starmer ever losing a vote in Parliament before the next general election, because that's just how the parliamentary arithmetic works. It's not just a big majority, it's one of the biggest majorities in post-war British political history. And yet we saw the government conceding a significant amount of ground on this legislation late last week because they took the view, rightly, clearly, that they were set to lose the vote as it stood. That the number of Labour MPs who had indicated either publicly or in some cases privately that they would vote against the government as it stood was so high. So the question now for the government today is what the impact of those concessions has been. I think the assumption in government was that once they made the concessions, which is to say making it so that existing claimants of personal independence payment remain receiving the same eligibility for that benefit before these changes come into effect and only future claimants are affected. Now, I think the government assumed that in making that announcement, the rebellion would melt away. Not so. On the contrary, there are still dozens of Labour MPs who are willing to vote against the government on this. And I have to say, I mean, I think most of us this morning thought that there was almost no chance that the government would still lose. But actually, I'm picking up pessimistic vibes from government, some people with a sort of awareness of the parliamentary arithmetic in government. So it's just worth keeping an eye, I think, even still, on how the parliamentary maths progresses between now and that crucial vote, as you say, which is at 7 p.m.
But without meaning to sound like we're pouring cold water over this, these reforms do have support, and there are many people, for example, the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, telling the BBC the changes are better than the current system. Many people want to see these changes go through, Henry.
Yeah, and many Labour MPs. I mean, Jonathan Reynolds is a government minister, so he was out. The way things work is that he was out talking about a different announcement this morning, and then collective cabinet responsibility requires him to throw his weight behind the reforms, although of course he supports them anyway, I'm sure. But by the reason I make that point is because there are actually a lot of Labour MPs who are not required to support the government on this, who really support the government and were furious. Not necessarily that the government conceded last week, because that was inevitable by that point, given the scale of the rebellion, but they were furious with their colleagues who had joined on to that rebellion against the government, saying it was a sign of lack of seriousness from MPs so early in Keir Starmer's government that they owed more loyalty to the man who led the election campaign on which they were elected, so many of these MPs, for the first time in 2024. So I think you really can't underestimate the amount of bad blood that's kind of swilling around the Parliamentary Labour Party at the moment in every which direction.
Henry, thank you for now. Let's bring in Faisal Islam, our economics editor, to talk through some of the bigger picture on this. Faisal, good morning. Good to see you. Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, has got a lot of money she needs to save. The figure of £5 billion has been thrown around. Talk us through the scale of what's at stake here.
So, and this is precisely the issue. In fact, if we take a step back, there is a really reasonable question, is this, which is what is the government trying to achieve here? And they say it's welfare reform. And indeed, there was a very detailed green paper on that subject, a consultation paper, essentially, with a whole suite of policies. But what happened was that those plans were pulled forward and sort of meshed together with a requirement, a separate requirement, to make some budget cuts to hit the Chancellor's budget target at the spring statement in March, and to help bridge a gap that appeared in the public finances against the Chancellor's own limits on borrowing. And so why does that matter? Actually, there's a lot of common ground here from all sections of the government, actually Parliament, employers and some campaigning groups. People don't think, in principle, so many, particularly young people, should be in receipt of these benefits. It would be much better for everybody if they were in a job. It would be better for them, it would be better for the taxpayer, it would be better for the economy, because it's a total disaster to have, in particular, young people not making that first attachment to the jobs market. So there's some common ground here. I think where they got onto a sticky wicket as regards the rebellion, perhaps not the rebellion today, but certainly the one last week, the likes of Treasury Select Committee Chair Meg Hillier and other chairs, where it got so big, was that it was clearly the motivation at first bite was to get that money back in. Whereas if you're trying to save that money long term, the argument would be you go for reform that means that the money's not required at some point. The problem there was that the Office of Budget Responsibility would not score that as a saving, and it wouldn't count towards your effort to get your budget into line. So that's that, if you like, is the story of what happened in terms of the government. The issue is, underlying all of this, is a significant rise in the number of claims, more than expected. A lot of people tally that with what happened during the pandemic. This is both in terms of physical illness and disability, musculoskeletal issues that have taken people out of the labour market, but also mental health, particularly with young people, has gone up much more than anybody had expected. So the total bill in this area, which was 36 billion before the pandemic, is heading for something like 70 billion, and they wanted to lop 5 billion off that. As a result, the compromise is they've rolled back about half of that. So that is if you like, the fundamental challenge. is that the prevalence of this. And so there's a couple of big questions here, I think, that aren't necessarily being answered. When the support system, general support system, was put in place for dealing with disability, was it always intended that there would be equivalent payments for those suffering from mental health issues? Was that, and then another issue that's actually been raised in the Green Paper and is raised by others in the think tank world is, are cash payments the right form of support for those with mental health problems or neurological issues? Is that the right level of support? Is some sort of therapy, in-kind support? They do this differently in other countries. And one last thing, there is an example of a country that's dealt with this problem and turned it round, which was the Netherlands 25 years ago. Now, their solution was to get employers essentially to pay for the first 2 years of support. Now, I don't think that would go here in the UK. Employers are feeling quite sort of hard done by right now. And indeed, many of the claimants, we're told, in the UK, they don't have that first rung on the jobs ladder to have an employer to pay. So there are other examples from around the world, and particularly around Europe. It is a key structural problem with significant consequences, not just for the individuals concerned, but for the economy and for the public finances.
Faisal, very good point there. You make lots of people trying to get their head around the complexities of that. We were discussing that with Nikki Fox, our disability news correspondent, earlier. Nikki, you were at protests yesterday down near Parliament. I'm curious to hear what people there were saying. But first of all, I would like to take this question from James, which has been sent in. Will people going through their PIP review, typically every 3 years, be classed as new claimants? James says this needs to be clarified, else it could just be a ruse to delay implementation of the original proposal. I've read numerous reports on the amendment, but can't see anything specific on this important point.
Yeah, no, this is a question that I've been asked a lot, and I've spent the past few days trying to get to the bottom of it, because as someone will know, when you get your personal independence payment reward, there'll be an end date. Some people might get that award for 1 year, for 2 years, some might get it for 10 years. It kind of depends on your disability and how your disability impacts you, but mostly there will be an end date, and when you get to that end date you will need to be reassessed. So we are hearing from the government, we've heard from the government, obviously these concessions, that existing PIP claimants will be protected, but as Jane mentioned, mentioned that if somebody that's claiming PIP now gets reassessed in, let's just say, December 2030, are they going to get reassessed under the existing rules now and not the new 4-point minimum criteria? And the DWP has confirmed that existing claimants of PIP now, regardless of when they get reassessed, if it's after November 2026, will be reassessed under the existing rules. They will not be reassessed under the new 4-point minimum requirement. And that's very important. I want to be really clear about that because there's so much concern around that. I mean, there's also the argument, the people we met yesterday, one person I spoke to, Adam, he works for Inclusion London. I've met him before, he's brilliant. And he was saying, he just doesn't agree with the two-tier system. He was saying, it doesn't make me happy that I'm going to be protected, but future disabled people aren't. And that is an argument that I'm hearing a lot of. But then I sat down with the Minister for Disabled People only a couple of weeks ago, who said something does have to change, as we've touched on today, that people with the greater need should have PIP and it should be there for a long time. And actually, the current system is unsustainable.
Nikki, thank you for that. I want to go to Henry Zeffman now, our chief political correspondent. Henry, we've had this question coming into us from the BBC News Instagram. Why do this instead of, say, an energy windfall tax?
Windfall tax on oil and gas companies, though you could increase the rate. I think what is absolutely the case and what that question reflects is that there are lots of people in the Labour Party, lots of Labour MPs, who would sooner do many other things and generate revenue for the government many other ways than by cutting welfare spending. And that's really what we're seeing in this rebellion. And I think what you will see, especially after the concessions last week, is even more talk here in Westminster that in the budget, which will come in the autumn from Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, the government will increase tax in some ways. And I think it's going to be a very interesting process to see what taxes the government might alight on. I mean, Faisal will know that better than me. Although what there is a real resistance to in the Treasury and in the Cabinet, people I speak to, is this idea that they say some of their colleagues, including Labour MPs, have, which is that there is some magical quick fix, be it a wealth tax or some other tax, which would instantly make all of the difficult economic problems that they face go away. That is not the dominant mode of thinking in Downing Street, be that number 10 or number 11.
And Henry, talk us through the mechanics of today. We said there's the debate at 1:30, the vote at 7. What are you watching for?
Well, it won't just be one vote, probably. So the amendment, it's called a reasoned amendment, and you might hear the word amendment and think, so it's a tweak. It's not actually. This is one of those examples where parliamentary language just doesn't really match up with what's actually happening. It's a wrecking amendment. What it would do is it would stop this piece of legislation at this stage. That's the amendment that we've been talking about earlier, which has been tabled by Rachel Maskell, a Labour MP, and signed up to by a further 38 Labour MPs. It's not certain that that amendment will even be voted on. That's up to the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. I think it's probable that he will choose it to have a vote, but I don't think it's definite. We'll find out on that at the start of the debate, so we'll actually know that early on. Then there'll be hours of debate, and it'll be fascinating to see what individual Labour MPs contribute to that debate, whether we get an indication of the way in which the mood of the House of Commons might be turning, and in particular the mood of Labour MPs. Then come 7, you will probably have a vote on that Rachel Maskell amendment. If that passes, that's it. The government has lost. If it falls, that is to say, if it doesn't get a majority support, then you're on to the main vote, which is a big yes or no vote on the principles of what the government is proposing here.
OK, Henry, thank you. To Faisal Islam now, our economics editor. Big question, potentially the biggest question. What is the government's fiscal position? How can we ever reduce government debt? That question coming to us via the BBC News TikTok.
Well, they would argue, and certainly the Treasury and the Chancellor would argue, this is why they have to be so careful. This is why originally they were looking for some savings in this area. They argue the bill is unsustainable. So you have to do something about that. Certainly, I think if you take a step back, what you get is the message that there's a whole lot of things they can't do. They've ruled out various large tax levers as a result of their manifesto. They've ruled out doing anything with the triple lock on pensions, which is obviously a significant part of what is deemed to be, and I know that recipients of the state pension would quibble with this, but was deemed to be part of the overall welfare budget. That's not to be touched. They've got this commitment to defence. We're told even in this area where they were trying to make savings, nothing can happen to anybody currently in receipt of such benefits. All of those have to be kept the same. So, you look for sort of flexibilities, ways that they can respond to changing events around the world. And it does look quite tricky. And it goes back to this point of the Chancellor came in a year ago, the Prime Minister came in a year ago, and they put in place these rules, these borrowing rules, what we call the fiscal rules. And it's trying to sort of, but the target moves depending on what's happening in the world in terms of the economy, what's happening to the rate of interest that's charged to governments. And it was actually a shift in that rate of interest, probably largely driven actually by what was happening in America with the tariff shock that the Chancellor responded to with this set of proposals that she's now had to half U-turn on. That process starts again, and that's what Henry was referring to with the budget. The gap is opening up. I think most forecasters think that if everything is left equal, about £4.5 billion worth of U-turns, if you include the winter fuel U-turn as well, and then changes to forecasts, leaves a gap of, and this is an estimate, of 10 billion-ish, which would take a notable, significant tax rise of some sort. And the sort of favourite proposal for that is the idea that you extend the freeze in income tax thresholds to raise those sorts of sums. No certainty in that. But yes, that's the challenge in terms of balancing the books that the Chancellor says she is sort of seized with right now.
OK, Okay, Faisal Islam, thank you so much for talking us through that. Faisal Islam, our economics editor there. We were also joined by Henry Zeffman, our chief political correspondent. Henry, thank you very much for joining us. And with me on set here, Nikki Fox, our disability news correspondent. Nikki, thank you so much. As discussed, a hugely complex but also a hugely important story. We'll be covering it live for the rest of the day across BBC News, including the debate at 13:30 and the vote itself at 7 p.m. You can follow it all on BBC News. Thank you for now. Bye-bye.